So, speaking of things that used to be heavily classified and are now no longer classified, I came across this article in Politico last month about this organization in the UK. They are called the National Security Strategic Investment Fund. And they were created in 2018, very classified when it started. And now here we are 7 years later, and all of a sudden they've declassified the fact of. And I'm reading about this organization, and they seem to be like a venture capitalist firm who can help with funding at different stages for companies developing technologies that they're calling dual use. Dual use meaning the technology has some national security benefit or could have a national security benefit, but also has a broader like economic applicability for greater society. So to me, that means the technologies themselves probably aren't very classified, with like stuff happening in AI or drones, but there'd be a specific national security use that would eventually be classified. And the article was touting all the benefits of these kinds of partnerships, right? Because it helps development, it helps innovation. It can, like I said, it has broader applications to society. It helps technologies have a first client, the government. They can test things out. The organization helps these smaller startups through the procurement process. It's a big space right now. Everybody's talking about defense. And the first thing I thought of when I read of this is, why on earth was this ever classified? Because any country that has any money is already doing this. I don't believe for 1 second there's a country that can afford to put some money into technology development that isn't already doing it. The reason is because we knew that this was important like hundreds of years ago. So, I'm thinking about this a lot because in Canada, we've got this new prime minister, Mark Carney, and he's like, yeah, we're going to ramp up defense spending and we're going to focus on developing Canadian technologies in the defense sector and yada, yada, yada. And I'm thinking, okay, like this is all, and I'm generally usually supportive of this kind of work because, like I said, a lot of the technology and the advancements, the innovation that happens in this space has broader applicability. It creates jobs, and a lot of really interesting other applications come out of these technologies. There's a long history in that. So, barring some exceptions, I'm usually pretty supportive of it. But what kind of blew my mind is that, and I find that lately as we're talking about all this new defense spending, is like nobody's talking about the history of it. So everybody's talking about it like, oh, this is a new thing we have to do, instead of thinking, okay, this has already been done. Let's not reinvent the wheel and let's talk about when it's been done really, really well. So one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time is this book called Loonshots. And it's this, just read it because it's amazing. It talks about, how to innovate and how companies can organize themselves to innovate and different types of innovation. It's a fascinating book. The stories in it are fantastic. But the first section talks about this guy, Vannevar Bush, and he was, and I wrote it down here, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II in the United States under Roosevelt. And he was responsible for creating an organization that ended up producing a lot of innovative technology that helped win the war. And one of the things I remember reading in Loonshots by this guy, Safi Bakal, great book, is that one of the things that Bush did really, really well is he understood that there's different types of people who need to contribute to innovation, right? So Bush talked a lot about soldiers and artists, and you need to have soldiers, and they're not necessarily literal soldiers. In a regular company, they'd be like your sales team or your marketing team. And then you need to have the artists, and those artists need to have a place to play, to create, to innovate, because here's one of the secrets about innovation, right, is not everything you try to innovate is a success. In that space, as an artist who's constantly creating and trying to come up with new ways of doing things, there has to be space for failure. There has to be space for, oh my God, this didn't work out. And so one of Bush's theories, now he wrote this book at the end in 1945, well, more like a report that he gave to Roosevelt. And it was called Science, the Endless Frontier. And Truman didn't really get on board with it when he took office. So there was like a little bit of back and forth. But apparently a lot of the principles in this Science, the Endless Frontier, I'll put a link in the comments, became part of how the United States started funding a lot of different sectors like health and, yes, national security. And there was another one I can't remember. And he talked about how it requires more than one type of person, right? It requires government, it requires universities who have the freedom to just explore and invent without constraint in a very autonomous way. And it requires industry because you need these things to be brought to market. And that's a really important component. And he wrote it all out in 1945. And I think that what I am really sort of not impressed by today is there's not a lot of acknowledgement from at least, the country that I'm in, that there are ways of doing this, and there are ways of approaching sort of bringing together national security interests and economic interests and all sorts of interests in a way that's productive for multiple groups within society, including the public. It doesn't have to be isolated. And Bush already thought of these things like, I don't know, this is like a long time ago now, 70 years ago. And I think there's a lot to learn from those old lessons. So the general gist of this video today is like this stuff becoming declassified. It's weird because we should already be doing this kind of stuff. And if you have any sort of brain, you know that government's already doing this kind of stuff. But the reason it also shouldn't remain hidden is because it requires people from all sorts of groups, right? And you need to innovate in different people who are going to be doing the innovation need to innovate in spaces that isn't always about bringing it to market right away, but having that space, having that creative space to have those failures and make those mistakes, where then when you do have your successes, you can pass it off to the next group, the soldier group, who can bring those things to market. And all of that requires investment. Anyway, Science, the Endless Frontier, Safi Bakal's Loonshots, a fantastic book. It really gets into a lot of this thinking, and I really hope that some of the leaders that are making decisions today read these two sources. Hope everyone's doing fantastic. If you have any questions, let me know.